Chapters 3 and 4 of Napoleon and Josephine, The Rise of the Empire, by Walter Geer. This recording is in the public domain. 3. 1789 to 1794. The Revolution. On the 5th of May, 1789, the States General assembled at Versailles, and Alexandre de Beauharnais was one of the members. He had presented himself to the noblesse of Blois as a candidate for the place of one of the two deputies to be elected by that bailiwick, and was chosen almost unanimously through the influence of Lavoisier. This was the Fermier Général Lavoisier, member of the Academy of Sciences. Established only 20 years at Blois, he had acquired by his liberality a great popularity. He was the real head of the Electoral Assembly, of which he was chosen secretary, and it was he who drafted the Cahier des Doléances. This memorandum of grievances which Alexandre was charged to support, was wholly inspired by the doctrines of Rousseau, and was the most revolutionary of any presented to the king. Beauharnais was faithful to his mandate, and on his arrival at Versailles, he ranged himself with the minority of the noblesse, the 47, beside Aiguillon, Lafayette, Lally Tollendal, La Rochefoucauld, and the Duc d'Orléans. On the night of the 4th of August, when feudal rights were abolished, and every man generously gave away what he did not own, Alexandre took a leading part. In recognition of his attitude on this occasion, on the 23rd of November, after the Assembly had moved to Paris, Beauharnais was chosen one of the 3 secretaries with Aiguillon as president. While Alexandre was thus playing one of the principal roles in the Constituent Assembly, the island of Martinique was in a state of turmoil. There was open war between the whites and the blacks. Taché, the uncle of Josephine, who was commandant of the port of Fort Royal, was elected mayor. There was a collision at St. Pierre between the two parties, and 15 blacks were killed. The garrison of Fort Bourbon revolted, and Taché was made prisoner by the rebels. The governor was compelled to evacuate not only the capital, but also the forts which defended it. Complete anarchy reigned on the island. Josephine was advised by her friends to leave, and she sailed for France on the 4th of September, 1790, on the frigate Sensible. Her departure was so hasty that she sailed almost without any changes of clothing, and during the voyage was thrown upon the charity of the officers of the ship for toilet necessities for herself and Hortense. She landed in France early in November, and went directly to Paris, where she lodged at the Hôtel des Asturies, Rue d'Anjou. At this time Josephine seems to have made another effort to bring about a reconciliation with her husband, but without success. Alexandre continued to live at the Hôtel of the Duc de La Rochefoucauld, and Josephine took an apartment in the Rue Saint-Dominique. The summer of 1791, Josephine and her children were with the Marquis and Madame Renaudet at Fontainebleau. Here she learned of the election of her husband as president of the Assembly on the 18th of June. 2 days later occurred the flight of the royal family to Varennes. The announcement was made by Beauharnais in opening the session of Tuesday the 21st of June, and the Assembly remained in permanent session until the afternoon of the following Sunday. During this period Alexandre, by force of circumstances, was the personage the most en vue in France, the head of all authority. The king was suspended, and the president of the National Assembly for the moment was sovereign. When his son Eugène was seen in the streets of Fontainebleau, the people cried, "Voilà le Dauphin!" It was a strange turn of the wheel of fortune which thus brought face to face the Marquis de Bouillé, the distinguished soldier of the Antilles, the last royal governor, who arranged the flight to Varennes, and this Beauharnais, who a few years before had vainly solicited the favor of being his aide de camp. One had been a valiant soldier, whose life had been devoted to his king and country, the other had never seen any active service, and his brief existence, up to the present time, had been a mixture of scandal and futility. In this encounter, by the irony of fate, it was the veteran who lost, and the carpet knight who won. The last of September the Constituent Assembly came to an end. As the retiring deputies, by an act of rare and imbecile disinterestedness, had declared themselves ineligible for election to the new Legislative Assembly, they were all forced to retire to private life. Alexandre set out at once for Loire et Cher, where he was named member of the administration of the department. At this time he bought some national property in the vicinity of Ferté-Beauharnais, of which he seemed to consider himself the sole owner since the emigration of his brother. But the exercise of his new civil duties was brief. Since the 25th of August he had been on the rolls of the General's Staff, with the rank of lieutenant colonel, and early in December he received an order to join the 21st Division, to which he was attached. The former President of the Assembly certainly took his time about entering upon his military duties, for he remained in the country until the last of January, and then came to Paris, where he devoted another month to arranging his affairs. At this time he was successful in securing a pension of 10,000 livres for his aged father. Finally he set out for the headquarters at Valenciennes. When hostilities began in April he was attached to the Third Corps, commanded by Maréchal de Rochambeau in person. He took part in the first operations, and personally sent to the Military Committee of the Assembly an account of the rout at Mons. For such distinguished services, Alexandre was promoted the last of May and assigned to the Army of the North under Maréchal Luckner. He continued to correspond with the Assembly, to describe the smallest skirmishes, and to give his impressions of events. He was one of the first to accept the revolution of the 10th of August, and was rewarded on the 7th of September by being promoted to Major General, and named Chief of Staff of the new army in course of formation at Strasbourg. The year 1792 came to an end without the Army of the Rhine making any forward movement. During the first months of the following year Beauharnais was still in Strasbourg or that vicinity. His name occurs in no reports. The 8th of March he was promoted to be lieutenant general, and on the 13th of May, when Custine was made commander of the Army of the North, Beauharnais succeeded him as general in chief of the Army of the Rhine. In June, after the fall of the Girondins, Alexandre was summoned to Paris to succeed Bouchotte as Minister of War. This nomination displeased the all-powerful Commune of Paris, which denounced Beauharnais as an aristocrat, and he wisely declined the appointment. By this time the public was beginning to realize that General Beauharnais was more fond of writing than of acting. Mayence was besieged, and the commander of the Army of the Rhine had something more important to do than to compose addresses. The last of June he finally set his 60,000 men in motion, and advanced on the enemy. As usual, he reported in the greatest detail the slightest skirmishes, but did nothing to effect the relief of Mayence, which after a brave defense was forced to capitulate on the 23rd of July. He then insulted the heroic defenders of the city by a proclamation to his army in which he said, "No one could expect a surrender so long as the Republicans had any ammunition or bread." At the same time he wrote the Jacobins of Strasbourg that the club ought to demand of the Convention the heads of the traitors of Mayence and send them to the King of Prussia. He then ordered his army to retreat to the lines of Wissembourg, and sent in his resignation, on the ground that, as a member of a proscribed caste, it was his duty to remove any subject of disquietude from the minds of his fellow citizens. Without any authorization he left his army and went to Strasbourg. It was a grave error thus to abandon his post in the face of the enemy, at a moment when Custine was on trial, Dillon under arrest, and all the generals of noble birth subject to suspicion. On the 21st of August his resignation was accepted, in terms which for all time must cover his name with opprobrium. He was ordered to retire at once to a distance of 50 miles from the frontier, to a place of residence of which he would inform the Convention. So ended the inglorious military career of Alexandre de Beauharnais. From October 1791 to September 1793, except for visits to her aunt at Fontainebleau, Josephine passed all her time in her Paris apartment. Then, on account of the new law regarding "suspects," she found it desirable to have a domicile outside the city, in order to obtain a certificate of civisme, good citizenship. For some unknown reason, instead of using Fontainebleau, she decided upon Croissy, a village on the Seine about 10 miles from Versailles. Here she subleased a house from Madame Hostan, a Creole friend from St. Lucie, who lived at Paris in the same Hôtel Rue Saint Dominique. She had a daughter of about the same age as Hortense, and the mothers had become intimate friends. The 26th of September, 1793, the citoyenne Beauharnais presented herself at the municipality of Croissy to make her declaration, and 2 days later she was joined by her son Eugène, who came from his school at Strasbourg. In her declaration there is no mention of Hortense, but this was probably an oversight. Mademoiselle de Vergennes, who passed this summer of 1793 at Croissy, states that it was then that she made the acquaintance of Hortense, who was 3 or 4 years younger than herself. At this time Josephine, to prove her civisme, placed Hortense with her old nurse Marie Lannoy at Paris, as an apprentice to learn dressmaking, and Eugène was articled to one Cochard, a carpenter, who was the national agent of the Commune of Croissy. This attack of civic fever, however, did not prevent Josephine from seeking society, and extending her acquaintance among the residents of Croissy. Among the friends she made at this time were Chanorier, through whom she afterwards bought Malmaison; Mademoiselle de Vergennes, who, as Madame de Rémusat, was to be her Dame du Palais; and Réal, who was to become Councillor of State, Commandant of the Légion d'Honneur, Comte of the Empire. During the month of January, 1794, armed with her certificate of civisme, Josephine returned to her apartment in Paris. Leaving Strasbourg so precipitately that he had not time to take with him his carriages and horses, Alexandre proceeded directly to his home at Ferté. From there he made haste to write the Jacobin Club of Blois to announce his early visit. On his first appearance, however, he was greeted with insults. He made a spirited reply, and thought that he had saved the situation. Reassured, he leased a small house in the city, and endeavored to gain the goodwill of his neighbors. At the same time he opened correspondence with his wife. In the face of their common peril, a kind of intimacy was established between them. In the meanwhile he was elected mayor of the little commune of Ferté. But Alexandre was not to enjoy very long his quiet life in the country. On the 2nd of March, 1794, by order of the Committee of General Security, he was arrested and conducted to Paris, where on the 14th of March he was confined in the Carme. On the 19th of April, by order of the same committee, Josephine was also arrested at Croissy, taken to Paris, and placed in the same prison. The old convent of the Church of Saint Joseph des Carmes, its walls still stained with the blood of the September massacres, is standing to-day in the Rue Vaugirard, close by the Luxembourg and the Odéon. At that time it was one of the most insanitary prisons of Paris. It was cold, damp, dirty, infested with vermin, poorly ventilated, and badly lighted. However, the society was excellent, although rather mixed. Grands seigneurs and grandes dames were mingled promiscuously with domestics and artisans. There Josephine was thrown again with her husband, and there seems to have been a good understanding between them, but nothing more. Alexandre conceived a great passion for Delphine de Custine, while Josephine engaged in a violent flirtation with General Hoche, who entered the Carme at about the same time. Every possible effort was made by Alexandre and Josephine to secure their liberty. Through Eugène and Hortense, who were allowed to visit their mother, communication was kept up with the outside world. Josephine's surly pug dog Fortuné, which was not noticed in the crowd, carried letters placed under her collar. The case against Alexandre, however, was too strong for him to hope for acquittal. His military career, his neglect to relieve Mayence, his desertion of his post, made a record hard to defend. On the 22nd of July he was taken to the Conciergerie. Realizing that it was the end, as he passed Madame de Custine, he handed her, as a farewell present, an Arab talisman mounted in a ring which he always wore on his finger. Alexandre faced death bravely. In those days, if few knew how to live, all knew how to die. Without trial, without testimony, without pleadings, without verdict, he was hurried to the guillotine in a batch of 55 victims. It was the 5th Thermidor. 4 days more. 4. 1794 to 1795. After the Terror. No words can depict the conditions in Paris during the Great Terror which began in March, 1794, and ended with the fall of Robespierre on the 27th of July. The law of suspects kept the prisons packed; the guillotine was constantly employed; the whole nation appeared doomed to the scaffold. The final 7 weeks between the 23rd Prairial (11th of June) and the 9 Thermidor were horrible. It was nothing more nor less than a massacre. In the course of these 45 days 1,376 heads fell in Paris. Fear was on every side. Drawing rooms were empty, wine shops were deserted. The very courtesans ceased to go to the Palais Royal, where virtue now reigned supreme. The Convention was well nigh deserted, the deputies had given up sleeping at home. When the head of Robespierre fell under the guillotine, a mighty shout of joy went up from the 100,000 beings massed in the Place de la Révolution. In the popular estimation, Robespierre had been the incarnation of the Terror, therefore his own downfall meant the end of the Terror. No such thought had been in the minds of Barras and Tallien when they struck down the dictator, but they were not slow to take advantage of this reaction in public opinion. The joy of the populace, however, was nothing in comparison with the delight of the reprieved prisoners, who had been hopelessly awaiting death. The daily roll call had ceased; it was never to be heard again. While the tumbrils conveyed to the scaffold the dreaded instruments of the Terror, Fouquier and the judges and jurymen, the former captives, were daily set free. At the same time 100,000 suspects issued from their hiding places. Their joy was beyond words. It was as if they had risen from the tomb or been born into life again. Josephine was one of the first of the prisoners to gain her liberty. 10 days after the fall of Robespierre, on the 19 Thermidor, 6th of August, she left the Carme. One of her companions in misfortune has drawn a sketch of her behavior in prison which is not wholly flattering. She was pusillanimous in the highest degree. She passed her time in telling her fortune with cards, and weeping in public, to the great scandal of her companions. But she was naturally affable, and does not this trait make us oblivious to many qualities which are lacking? Her tournure, her manners, her voice above all, had a particular charm, but it must be admitted that she was neither magnanimous nor frank. The other prisoners pitied her for her lack of courage. Nevertheless, Josephine was very popular. When the prisoners heard her name pronounced they applauded furiously. With that grace which never left her, she made her adieux to each one, and left amidst the good wishes and blessings of all. It has been stated that she owed her prompt liberation to Madame de Fontenoy, the future Madame Tallien, her companion in prison, but Thérésia was confined in La Force and not at the Carme. Josephine had other friends, however, who were not less powerful. Hoche, who left his prison on the 4th of August, Réal, Barère, Tallien, to mention only a few of the names. Tallien himself always claimed the honor, and to him Eugène gave the credit at a later date. But very little is known of the life of Josephine during the 12 months following her release from prison. As the seals were still attached to her apartment in the Rue Saint Dominique, she probably passed the autumn of 1794 in her house at Croissy. Barras states in his Mémoires that on leaving the Carme she became the mistress of Hoche. If so, the liaison must have been very brief. Hoche was transferred to the Conciergerie the middle of May, and was set free only 2 days before Josephine. 12 days later he was appointed general-in-chief of the army of the Côte de Cherbourg, and left Paris to take up his new command not later than the 1st of September. At this time he seems to have been very much in love with his young wife, from whom he had been separated almost immediately after their marriage in February, by being ordered to the army of Italy, and later by his imprisonment. Admitting that he carried on a lively flirtation with Josephine during the few weeks that they were thrown together in the Carme, it seems much more probable that Hoche passed with his bride the short period that he was in Paris at this time. Furthermore, it is absurd to attempt to draw any conclusions as to this liaison from the fact that Hoche gave Eugène a position on his staff. The general had been in close relations with Alexandre in the army, and these ties had been drawn closer by their confinement in the same prison. What then could be more natural than the wish of Hoche to relieve the burden of his friend's widow by assuming the responsibility of her son? This also is his own explanation of the matter in a letter written to the marquis 2 years later, after the second marriage of Josephine. There is no doubt, however, that during these 12 months Josephine was in great financial difficulties. She had on her hands the lease both of her Paris apartment and the house at Croissy. Her father had left his affairs in great confusion, and the difficulty of getting money from Martinique was further increased by the war with England. In February 1794 the English had taken possession of the island, and the Taché estate was in the hands of the enemy. In France the property of her husband had been confiscated by the government. The expenses of Josephine's household at this time were quite heavy. She had 3 domestics, the nurse, Marie Lannoy, the maid, Agathe Rible, and the valet, officieux, Gontier. She not only paid them no wages, however, but even borrowed their little savings. Her principal resource was a Monsieur Emery, a banker at Dunkerque, who for many years had had business relations with the Tachets. This Emery had been colonel of the National Guard, deputy to the Legislative Assembly, and mayor of Dunkerque. During the Terror he was imprisoned, and only a serious illness saved him from the guillotine. In the year 3, 1794–95, he was again elected mayor, and resumed his commerce with the Antilles. For a period of 3 years he had advanced to Josephine the funds of which she had need. On the 1st of January, 1795, Josephine writes to her mother that without the aid of her friend Emery, she does not know what would have become of her. She urges Madame Taché to remit to her, either through London or Hambourg, all the funds at her disposal, not merely the income, but also the capital sum. Her mother seems to have done her best, but the remittance was only moderate in amount. Josephine then drew on her mother a sight draft for £1,000 sterling, writing her at the same time how important it was for her to meet the draft, as the money was due to friends who had already advanced it to her. In the meantime she succeeded in having the seals removed from her apartment, and recovered possession of her effects. She also managed to have turned over to her the silver and books left by Alexandre in his country house, and was paid by the government the sum of 10,000 livres on account of the furniture which had been sold. From these few details it is possible to judge how precarious was the life of Josephine during the greater part of this year. But with the small remittances she received from Martinique, with money she borrowed on every side, with bills which she contracted everywhere, she somehow managed to exist, and her life was far from being devoid of luxury. She was not a woman to walk, and must have a carriage, which she hired by the month. She had not yet worked out the combination by which she obtained in June, 1795, from the Committee of Public Safety, a carriage and 2 horses, in exchange for the horses and equipages which Alexandre had left with the Army of the Rhine. She was fond of flowers, and could not live without them. Her toilettes, which were quite modest, included such items as a piece of muslin at 500 livres, 2 pairs of silk stockings at 700 livres, and a shawl at 1,200 livres. But let not the reader be amazed at these figures. 1,000 livres assignats then represented only about 53 livres in gold. At this time Josephine was on very intimate terms with Madame Tallien, the most beautiful woman of her day. Theresia was the daughter of Francis Cabarrus, a famous banker and finance minister of Spain. In 1788, at the age of 14, she was married to the elderly Comte de Fontenoy, a councillor of the Parlement of Bordeaux. During the early days of the Revolution her wit and beauty made her a favorite in the salons of Paris. Later she attempted with her husband to join her father in Spain, but they were arrested at Bordeaux as suspects. At that time Tallien was exercising all the rigors of the Terror in the department of the Gironde. He thus met Theresia, fell in love with her, and released Fontenoy on condition that he should apply for a divorce. She then became at first the mistress, and later the wife of the proconsul. After the Reign of Terror, and the dictatorship of Robespierre, the woman hater, the new regime found its incarnation in this woman of easy morals. It is a curious fact that, after her divorce by Tallien in 1802, she married Prince de Chimay, and became the mother of a son who espoused Emilie, the daughter of Napoleon and the lovely Madame Pelapra. She was, so far as known, the only daughter of the Emperor. There were many points of resemblance between Josephine and Theresia. Both had the same tastes, the same desires, the same love of luxury. Neither of them had any moral scruples, and they were both looking for some one rich enough to satisfy their caprices. Husband or lover, it mattered little which. Theresia, who was only 20 years of age at this time, had the advantage over Josephine both of youth and beauty, but in grace and charm she could not be compared with the fascinating Creole. Theresia was not a woman to be satisfied long with a man like Tallien. She soon found their chaumière in the Allée des Veuves too small a theatre for her talents. Nothing would satisfy her but the rarest flowers, the most exquisite wines, and toilettes which did not cost less from the fact that they were most diaphanous. From Tallien she passed to Barras, who soon turned her over to the rich banker Ouvrard, tout en conservant les privautés qui lui conviennent. In August 1795, when her affairs were still in the same precarious condition, Josephine leased from Julie Caro, the wife of the actor Talma, from whom she was separated, a little hôtel, entre cour et jardin, at No. 6 Rue Chantereine. This was a short street recently laid out from the Faubourg Montmartre to the Chaussée d'Antin. It was lined with the residences of filles entretenues. The lease was for 3 years, with privilege of 2 renewals, and the rent was 10,000 francs in assignats. The entrance to the hôtel was by a porte cochère through a long corridor, at the end of which was a little garden, with 2 small pavilions which contained the stable and carriage house. In the middle was the house, consisting only of a rez-de-chaussée, with an attic above and cellar below. There were 5 rooms: an antechamber, a bedroom, a salon, which also served as a dining room, another small salon, used as a boudoir, and a wardrobe. The servants' quarters were in the attic. Although small, the house demanded quite a staff of servants: a porter, a coachman, a chef, and a femme de chambre. Josephine at this time set up her carriage with 2 horses, the same which she had obtained from the government. Before taking possession of her new home, Josephine had spent a very considerable amount in repairing and adding to the furniture of her apartment in Rue St. Dominique. Nothing, however, was very luxurious. The salon was furnished only with a round mahogany table, and 4 chairs covered with black horsehair. On the walls were hung a few prints framed in dark wood. It is interesting to note, in passing, that this short street, or rather the locality where it was afterwards laid out, was originally known under the name of La Victoire. Later the place was called Chantraine, on account of the frogs which chanted there. After the campaign of Italy it was again called Rue de la Victoire in honor of Napoleon, and is still known by that name to day. At this time the nurse Marie Lannoy was no longer with Josephine, as she had placed Hortense in the new school which Madame Campan had just founded at St. Germain. She also sent for Eugène, whom Hoche would have been only too glad to keep on his staff, and placed him in quite an expensive institution which had just been opened at St. Germain, under the name of the Collège Irlandais. The overthrow of Robespierre on the 9 Thermidor was due largely to Barras, and for the next 2 years he was perhaps the most prominent man in France. For power in itself he cared but little, but he greatly enjoyed the advantages derived from it: the money, the luxury, and, above all, the women. Paul Barras was born in Provence in 1755, of a good family. In his youth he served as a lieutenant against the British in India. In 1789 he was chosen a member of the States General, and took an active part in the storming of the Bastille and the Tuileries. The siege of Toulon owed its success largely to his activity and energy. After the 9 Thermidor, as president of the Convention, he acted with decision both against the intrigues of the Royalists and the excesses of the Jacobins. He was brave, he was a gentleman, and with much reason he despised the rabble by whom he was surrounded. As Lefebvre said of Talleyrand, "He was a mess of filth in a silk stocking." But unlike Talleyrand he had courage, and when occasion demanded did not hesitate to draw the sword and throw away the scabbard. It was a curious side of the nature of Barras that while he associated with the commonest of men he wished to have around him only women of the Ancien Regime. He must have, in his intimate relations, grace, elegance, and distinction. He could not expect to find ladies of the highest rank; they had all immigrated or died on the scaffold; but he sought those who, to save their heads or their fortunes, had compromised themselves with the leaders of the popular party, and who, with the return of luxury, were ready to do anything to satisfy their caprices. He had not money enough to meet their demands from his own resources, but he put them in contact with bankers and contractors whom he exploited himself, and whom he permitted them to exploit in turn. Among this galaxy of pretty women of loose morals, the bright particular stars were Theresia and Josephine. Some one must have paid for the new luxury of Josephine, and there is little doubt that Barras was at this time her lover. He is ungallant enough to say so in his Memoir, and for once he seems to have told the truth. As President of the Convention, member of the Committee of General Security, General-in-Chief of the Army of the Interior, Barras was really more powerful then than later as a member of the Directory. In July, 1795, he returned from a mission to the north. On the 13 Vendémiaire (5th of October) he commanded the troops of the Convention. On the 1st of November he became a Director, and on the 4th he installed himself at the Luxembourg. There is a remarkable coincidence between these dates and the events in the life of Josephine. On the 17th of August she signed her lease for the Hôtel Chantraine. The following month she sent her children to school. The 2nd of October she moved into her new home, and the 6th she gave the orders to furnish luxuriously her chambre à coucher. By midsummer the liaison was already well established, and during the autumn they met frequently at Croissy. "We had Madame de Beauharnais for a neighbor," writes Pasquier. "Her house adjoined our own. She only came there occasionally, once a week, to meet Barras, with the many persons who followed in his suite. As is not rare with Creoles, the house of Madame de Beauharnais had an air of luxury, while the most essential things were lacking. Chicken, game, rare fruits filled the kitchen, while they came to our humble abode to borrow the kitchen utensils, plates, and glasses which they lacked." On the 4th of November, 1795, the newly elected directors took possession of the Luxembourg, which had been assigned them as an official residence. The palace had been used as a prison during the Revolution, and all of the furniture had mysteriously disappeared. There was no one to receive them except the concierge, who loaned them for their first meeting a dilapidated table and some cane bottomed chairs. As soon as the salons were refurnished and Barras began to hold his "court," Josephine and Theresia were among the first to appear. This court was made up of women of the old noblesse, and there reigned, in spite of assertions to the contrary, a very good tone. A certain cold reserve, rather than the abandon of bad taste. The ladies were nearly all widows, and very few husbands were to be seen. Besides the Luxembourg and her house at Croissy, Josephine also met Barras at a house which he owned or leased at Chaillot, as is shown by a letter still in existence. The citoyenne Beauharnais invites the citoyen Réal to give her the pleasure of his company for dinner, chez elle, at her home, to-morrow the 25th. The citoyens Barras and Tallien are to be present. This letter is dated the 24 Pluviose, en 4, 13 February, 1796, and is written from the residence of Barras at Chaillot. End of chapters 3 and 4.